Japanese July is over, and boy, do we need more relief than Bob Birch told. Call back to episode number 4. But this week, it's a mystery, and not in the sense that I don't know what I'm going to talk to you about, but because the story is actually a mystery. You get it. It's Our Weird World.
Our Weird World.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and this week we are looking at the story of Martin Guerre in France. As you'll see, this story is just odd and would probably make for a good Netflix documentary if this had happened in this century instead of the 1500s. It's story time. Martin Guerre was born in 1524 in the Basque region of France. And at age 14, or about when half of his life was over in those days, he married Bertrand de Rolles, and, who was probably equally as young, if not younger. In 1548, so at this point, Martin is 24 years old. Martin was accused of stealing grain from his father, and then he mysteriously disappeared. And thanks to Roman Catholic canon law, Bertrand was never allowed to remarry. Like, Martin just disappeared, and so Bertrand was just forced to kind of carry on as, like, is she a widow? Is she divorced? Is she single? Like, it was weird. And, like, she just had no choice in it. 9 years later, in 1557, Martin returned to Artegat, the town where he had met his wife and had lived before his disappearance. Other than looking 9 years older, most of the villagers and his uncle, his 4 sisters, and even his wife believed that Martin had finally returned home. But some people were a little suspicious. For the next 3 years, the Guerre family lived happily together. They had 2 more children, and everything just seemed to be going fine. When Guerre's father died, Martin claimed the inheritance and sued his uncle, Pierre Guerre, for another part of it. After the lawsuit, Pierre got really suspicious about that and started to believe that the man who had arrived in Artegat 3 years before wasn't actually Martin. When a soldier, passed through town, because apparently, France just had random soldiers walking through towns back then, Pierre asked if the soldier had known Martin. And the soldier claimed that he did and said that the man in Artegat claiming to be Martin was an imposter because the real Martin had actually lost his leg in one of the billion wars that every European nation was fighting in at the time. And with this information, Pierre and his sons attacked, fake Martin with a club. But Bertrand rushed in and broke up the fight because she still believed that the guy that was getting beaten up was actually Martin and her real husband. In 1559, 2 years later, Martin was accused of arson and impersonating the real Martin Guerre. But Bertrand came to Martin's defense and he was acquitted the following year. However, Pierre still didn't give up. Like, he was still convinced that this guy claiming to be Martin really wasn't him. Pierre kept investigating on his own and believed that a man named Arnaud de Til, French, from a nearby village was actually impersonating Martin. And eventually Pierre, his wife, Bertrand's mother all convinced Bertrand to follow through with a lawsuit against Arnaud. The case went to trial in 1560, but when Bertrand and Arnaud both accurately recounted an intimate event from their life prior to Martin's disappearance in 1548, the case hit a standstill. And that's like, Pierre wasn't expecting that. There was no way, it was one of those things where it's just like, oh, well, if you're the real Martin, what happened, that one night in the barn with the cows and Bertrand, you know what I'm talking about. And then Martin and Bertrand both just in the same exact detail, described the event. Martin, but, even though it seemed like, this, Martin was really Martin and that, it was truly him, he got ballsy. And he told Bertrand that if she could swear that he was not the real Martin, he would happily agree to be executed. And he totally expected Bertrand to be like, yes, you are my love, blah, blah. I don't know what accent that is. But Bertrand stayed quiet. And that was enough to keep the case going on. Over 150 witnesses claimed that guy truly was Martin Guerre, while a bunch of other people claimed that it was this guy named Arnaud Dutil. Others had no clue what was going on. They were just happy to be part of the whole situation. Finally, the guy was convicted of being an imposter, and he was sentenced to the guillotine. The guy who claimed to be Martin immediately appealed the decision, and the case was sent to the city of Toulouse. Bertrand and Pierre were also arrested on false accusations and perjury, and so now everybody's arrested and on trial. Martin was cross-examined, and his statements under oath about his life were double and triple checked, and no one found any discrepancies in the stories. Like, this guy, like, he absolutely had to be Martin Guerre. But then, like some really bad court drama or a poorly made sci-fi movie where the evil twin claims to be the real person, a man hobbling on a wooden leg burst into the courtroom, and he's like, I am the real Martin Guerre, or whatever. I don't know French accents. This new man was questioned about his life, and at times, like, he even didn't know the answer to the questions being asked of him, all while the man who was under trial knew everything. Like, he had all of the answers. But when both men were physically presented to the Guerre family, they all agreed that the dude with the wooden leg was the real Martin Guerre. Arnaud, to his credit, he maintained that he was the real Martin Guerre. It's like, I am the real Martin Guerre. No, I am the real Martin Guerre. No, I am the real Martin Guerre. You know, just back and forth, just really ridiculous stuff. And, you know, even though he just continued to claim that he was the real Martin Guerre, it didn't help. He was finally convicted of adultery and fraud. Adultery because he had actually had 2 kids with Bertrand, claiming to be Martin Guerre. And he eventually confessed. And he said that he had learned about Guerre's life after 2 men actually mistakenly confused Arnaud for Martin Guerre. And, you know, why he spent a long time learning about the most minute details of a random person's life is still a mystery. Like, no one's ever figured that out. But eventually, like, Arnaud really did confess, like, Pierre had it right the entire time. Like, this dude was an imposter. And on September 16th, 1560, Arnaud was actually hanged in front of Martin Guerre's house. So, with one big mystery solved, the question still remained as to where the real Martin Guerre had been for the last 9 years. And after being accused of stealing the grain from his father, Martin had just moved to Spain, where he served in the Spanish army. He had been deployed to Flanders and participated on the attack on St. Quentin in 1557, and that's where he had lost his leg, like the passing soldier had claimed. No one ever really decided to ask him why he had come back to France. And, you know, Bertrand at this point was like, hey, you're my real husband. Come back to me. And Martin was like, no, you are pretty dumb. You fell for a guy who claimed to be me when he clearly wasn't me. You had 2 kids with him. Like, I'm done with you. I'm going back to Spain, I guess. And that's how that story ends. All right. This one got silly. Thankfully, you don't have to spend the next few days or 5 minutes, if we're being honest. You don't care that much about this. You don't have to spend any amount of time figuring out if it really was an imposter or if it really was Martin. Everything, for the most part, worked out in the end. So let's see what we learned today. What did we learn? Number 1, old Catholic rules suck. Like, you get married at 14, something out of your control happens, and then you can't remarry to someone better. Like, you just live your life as a single woman, having to take care of kids or whatever 1500s women did at the time. I mean, obviously, that's the stuff that Jesus really cares about. You know, it's, you know, once you get married, you're done. Dude, you know, disease, war, famine, murder. I don't care about that. I care about making sure These two people stay married. That's where Jesus's priorities are. I don't know. Number 2, some people have to be really dumb in order to be tricked by an imposter, especially if it's your wife. Like, obviously I'm not married yet, but if I got married and I disappeared and then some other bald bearded guy showed up and he was like, "Hey, I am your husband, John. Do you not remember me?" Like, I mean, he didn't talk like that, but yeah, I totally believe you. Like, no, who is that dumb? All right. Anyway, number 3, I guess this isn't really something we learned, but we really don't know what happened to Martin and Bertrand after everything settled down. I mean, I guess they both lived their own separate lives until they died, which in 1500s France was probably just like a couple of days later anyway. Next week on Our Weird World, you are going to learn the story of Henry Barry Lowry, a North Carolina Native American who became sort of a vigilante hero during the Civil War. It's a really fun story. He's like Civil War Robin Hood. But thank you for listening. Tell all your friends and keep it weird.